Alex Trayman, it is great to have you back with us, my friend. When something is happening like we see in Israel right now, these massive protests, you are the man we call on. For many of our viewers, they're asking, what is happening in Israel right now? Number one, what's the state of play right now, I guess you would say, in the streets in Israel? And does it look like Prime Minister Netanyahu will pause this judicial reform? And in a minute, we'll talk more about what that judicial reform is all about.
Well, the situation is pretty intense here in Israel now. We've had massive protests from the anti-Netanyahu opposition that are opposed to judicial reforms in the streets for several weeks running, and they've really intensified over the past several days, especially after the surprise firing of Yoav Gallant, who's Benjamin Netanyahu's defense minister, who openly called for the judicial reforms to be halted while Netanyahu was overseas in London. And today, for the first time now, those in favor of judicial reform, those who support Netanyahu's right-wing government, are going to hold their first counter demonstration in just a couple of hours.
You and I were talking before the interview and saying, man, there's so much to unpack here, but you do a great job of just boiling it down. The judicial reforms, in essence, seem to be Bibi saying, hey, and his coalition saying, hey, the judiciary in Israel is dominated by the left. They choose amongst themselves and they have way too much power. Does that seem to be the overriding view of the Netanyahu government and why they want to reform the judiciary?
Well, you simplified it greatly. This is an activist court that openly cancels legislation, tells the executive branch of government what is allowed to do, what it is not allowed to do, can rule on anything it chooses at any time, and makes it almost impossible for a right-wing government like the one that Netanyahu has from advancing its political agenda. So this isn't just, about a court that happens to be left-wing. It's a left-wing court that can prevent a right-wing government from achieving its policy initiatives. So the first thing that Netanyahu really needed to do when he got into office, now that he actually has a right-wing government, is for the first time in decades, he has the opportunity to try to rein in the court. Now, you'll remember that after 5 consecutive elections in which the left and the anti-Netanyahu opposition tried everything to get Netanyahu out of office, that Netanyahu scored a historic victory, right-wing victory, almost a landslide right-wing victory, in which 64 seats went to his right-wing government, with only 46 seats going to the left. That's an 18-seat gap. And now Netanyahu has religious parties in his coalition. He has parties that believe in Jewish rights in Judea and Samaria, that the international community calls the West Bank. These are what's known as the settlers. So he has a full right-wing government and now wants to change the court. And the left wing, they know that if they lose the court, that it's going to change the fabric of the country. So this is really it's a culture war that's taking place in Israel between those that see Israel as a light unto the nations, a nation that stands alone, a country that is nationalist, traditional in nature, versus a secular left wing that sees Israel as an extension of Western Europe on the Eastern Mediterranean.
Yeah, and this is unprecedented, Alex, in many ways, at least in the modern state of Israel, in that we now have talk of reservists in the military not reporting for duty and protest of judicial reforms. Is there a larger battle here? And I think you touched on it, Alex, in a great way. It seems like there's a larger battle here at work. Right now, Israel is the epicenter, but globally, there seems to be, on the part of the left, a rejection of election results that they don't like them, and a push, as you mentioned, against traditional Judeo-Christian values and civilization. And the seat of that, of course, is the land of Israel and the city of Jerusalem.
I think you've hit it right on the head. I mean, this is really it's a question of vision of the country, and there's been a lot of social codes that the left wing has broken here. You touched on one with the reservists saying that they will not report for duty if they don't like the government's policies, and legislative agenda with judicial reform. But they've been convincing diaspora Jewry, Jews in America, to come out and openly criticize the government. They have pushed business owners in Israel to take their money outside of Israel. Essentially, the left wing is promoting boycott, divestment, and sanctions on Israel. Yeah, after we've been fighting against that for 10 years. So really, almost every social code has been broken. Just today, a national strike was called. There are literally no flights going in and out of Israel right now because the labor union refuses to operate the airport or banks or shopping malls. So the opposition has basically stood up and said, yes, you can win the election, but we are the ones that control the institutions. And the left wing here controls the upper echelons of the military. They control the media. They control the universities, and they control the labor unions. And they're just standing up and saying, look, you won the election, but you don't control this country. And they're actually proving that the government is maybe the weakest link.
Yeah, and this has really been going on, Alex, for about 12 weeks since Bibi was sworn in once again as Israel's prime minister. Looking ahead, and perhaps he pauses these reforms, as you mentioned, we don't know yet. But if he does pause the reforms, which have been the pillar of his new government so far, really his first initiative upon taking office was to try and get this all passed. Does that hurt him with his base? I mean, on one hand, obviously he's got these massive left-wing led protests, but on the other hand, if he kind of blinks, so to speak, here in the face of the protest, does that hurt him with his base and members of his governing coalition? And could we perhaps see his government eventually collapse?
Well, Netanyahu is between a rock and a hard place right now. You know, the hardcore ideologues on his right are basically saying, well, you know, we signed up for judicial reform. We signed up for a right-wing government. We're seeing now, because of Israel's attorney general and the court, that the government is unable to advance a right-wing agenda. And now Netanyahu may actually come, like you said, and freeze the reforms. And they said, this is not what we signed up for. So if we're not going to get what we signed up for, then we might as well bolt. But then on the other side, what you have, and this is important to understand, is that many people that voted for the right wing, voted for Netanyahu's Likud party, are very, very upset at the state of affairs in Israel right now. And they do hold Netanyahu and the Likud party at least partly to blame for the mess, because they did not do a good job in explaining the judicial reforms to the country. They rushed it out quickly. They went with a no holds barred attitude, and they did not. Nobody anticipated what the opposition to these judicial reforms could look like from an unfettered left, which has broken every social code that this country was founded on. So they didn't see that coming. They didn't game this out properly, and now you have a huge mess. And so you do have a lot of people, even in Netanyahu's own camp, saying, listen, you know, we can't have hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. We can't have the whole country on strike. You have to pause the reforms and get this under control. So on the one hand, if Netanyahu pauses, he potentially could lose members of his coalition to his right flank. And if he doesn't pause the legislation, he potentially loses support from his more moderate Likud base. He already had to fire his defense minister, Yoav Gallant, on yesterday. So he really has to thread the needle over here and figure out, you know, how he can glue his coalition together, because the coalition right now is the only thing he has.
Yeah, Alex, I haven't heard anyone explain it as eloquently and just put it in as simple terms as you just did. A great job, my friend. And this was a service to our audience, believe me, because everyone here in the States is wondering what is going on. Is Bibi in trouble? So you really broke it down in a great, easy to understand way. And we both know that Israeli politics can be very complex, to say the least. Last question. We have Passover approaching, obviously, Israel's Independence Day, a lot of great holidays and milestones coming up in Israel. That's one part of the timing here. But the other part of the timing that concerns me, Alex, is, look, Israel's external enemies, whether it's Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas, they're watching this. And they're kind of salivating, seeing all this internal unrest in Israel. What's your take there? I mean, are you concerned that external actors and enemies could try to take advantage here?
Well, it's not just external enemies. We have internal enemies as well. You know, we just started the Muslim holy month of Ramadan here, which has been traditionally a tense month. I mean, I saw a headline in the Jerusalem Post that noted that the first mass prayer that took place on the Temple Mount was peaceful. And it's interesting that the headline, there's only one religion in the world where the reporter would have to stress that the mass prayer session was peaceful. So, we've had 3 shootings in Samaria in the last 3 weeks in a town called Huwara. And so you have an ongoing situation where the terror threat from factions inside the Palestinian territories like Hamas and Fatah, are certainly increasing. And the Iran threat is as potent as ever. And there is a sense in the Israeli security establishment that we're coming to a now or never moment with regard to preventing Iran from crossing the nuclear threshold. And Netanyahu has actually traveled in the last month. He's been to France, he's been to Germany, he's been to Italy, and he's been to the UK. And that's all with this judicial reform mess brewing inside the country. And those meetings have only to do with one subject, which is Iran. And so when Yoav Gallant, who was the defense minister, came out in his speech and said that the judicial reform weakens Israel's defense capabilities, he sent a terrible message to Israel's enemies. He had the president of Israel, Isaac Herzog, say that the last 2 times there was a Jewish Commonwealth in the state of Israel that it didn't make it till its 80th year, and that he was afraid as Israel comes into its 75th birthday, as you mentioned on the Independence Day later in next month, that Israel might not make it to its 80th birthday. And just 2 days after he made that statement in his speech, Hassan Nasrallah, the bureau chief of Hezbollah, quoted the Israeli president saying, even Israel's president says that Israel might not exist in 5 years. And so this is definitely encouraging Israel's enemies to step up their fight against the Jewish state. So, I don't think that the protesters on the streets are really paying attention to what the consequences of their actions are. And they are tearing the country in half and making it much more harder for Israel to prove its legitimacy on the international stage, and making it harder for Israel to defend itself against its enemies.
Alex, a very precarious time, needless to say. We are praying for the land of Israel, for the nation of Israel, for sure. Hey, we can't thank you enough for your great insights here. This was such a great breakdown, Alex, and we appreciate your great work at jns.org. Keep it up, my friend. God bless. We'll see you again soon for more updates.
Thanks so much, Eric.